One of the most common, well meaning, but misunderstood accessibility recommendations is to use ARIA label to make things more accessible. It seems to make sense at first. It's the ARIA that people are most likely to encounter. It's one of the easier ones to understand. And using an attribute seems a little more techy and less of a workaround at first than adding a hidden span. The main problem here is that technical documentation often provides definitions and basic examples, but it rarely includes real world scenarios, especially when it doesn't quite match the situation that you're trying to use it for. It's hard to know when not to use something or when a better alternative exists because documentation usually focuses on what to fix and not how to choose the best approach. With ARIA label, like most ARIA attributes, it's not that you're going above and beyond by using one, like when you revisit alt text to make sure it's properly describing an image within its context. For all but a couple of cases, you're either using ARIA label correctly or you're not. It's something that can and should be used in certain circumstances, but as things have evolved, we've come up with a better and more reliable option for a lot of use cases. When we're considering using ARIA label, there are going to be a few additional options that you'll want to be aware of. ARIA label is used for a short title or a name when that text isn't already near it, and it should be concise. ARIA labeled by is used instead of ARIA label when the text is already on the page. And then we have ARIA described by, which is extra information about what that element is, what it does, or how to use it. And then we have screen reader only text. When you need to add some additional text to something to provide additional context that a screen reader user might need, we can use a class to add some CSS to an element and hide it for visual users. You add the class to whatever you want to hide, whether that's to some kind of container, like when you're including instructions for screen reader users, or by adding a span to part of the text that you want to hide, like when you're adding more text to a read more link in a blog post grid. Any code or examples that I show on the screen will also be available at the link in the description. So what you're going to do is add this CSS to your theme. And then if you use the same class name that I have here, which is sr-only, that's what you would add in the class for whatever you wanted to hide. If you're using the block editor, there's a WordPress plugin called Screen Reader Text Format, which will make the process a lot easier. A common method for improving the heading structure of certain landmarks would be to use a screen reader only heading. So in the code example, there's an aside, which would be your sidebar, and you have an H2 with the class sr-only, and it says sidebar, and then all of the different areas within that sidebar can then have an H3 with things like recent posts or follow us or subscribe or whatever else you wanted in the sidebar. For visual users, they see that it's a separate section on the page. And for screen reader users, they can also now identify that this separate area of the page in multiple ways. Same with the footer. If they're navigating through the site using the headings, they can then easily know that this is the footer area, and then the different sections within the footer can do the same thing. Get in touch, subscribe, find us, all of those types of things can then go in the footer. This lets users navigate throughout the page a little easier while allowing things like footers and sidebars to use that more semantic and visually appropriate heading levels. So let's get into it. When should you use ARIA label? First would be for labeling landmarks. When there are multiple instances of a navigation or an aside or some other supported landmark, a label is going to help screen reader users differentiate between them and navigate to them faster. If there's a heading, you can use that to label the section with ARIA labeled by, and then you would use ARIA label when there isn't. You can use ARIA labeled by on screen reader text, so if you're using the hidden heading method for a sidebar, you can use that. In this example, we have a header and a footer. In the header, we have a nav, and then in the footer, we have two nav elements. So in the header, the nav has an ARIA label of main, and we're avoiding using words like navigation or nav because the screen reader is going to announce this as a navigation because of the nav HTML tag. In the footer, we're actually including two headings. We have a heading 2 with an ID of footer company heading, and then that's called company links. And then we also have another area in the footer with a heading of resources that has an ID of footer resources heading. Now for each of those, there's a navigation under them. So what we can do is with using those IDs in each of the headings, we can then label those navigations using ARIA labeled by. This way we're not duplicating our work and we're making sure that it is as accessible and translatable as possible. Now, as a reminder, you would only need to do this if there are multiple instances of these landmarks. If you only have one navigation on your page, you don't need to label it. If you only have one aside, you don't need to label it. The next instance of using ARIA label as the preferred method would be an icon-only button. Now, ideally, the button is going to include text like close instead of just an X. But if that's not possible, then without the proper context, a button with an image in it or the letter X in it doesn't have the context that visual users have. We see it as part of this pop-up or overlay in the top corner, and we can see that it's going to close that. But screen reader users are going to need a little bit of extra context. So here is an example of a button that is using an SVG to use that X or whatever icon to close this. And so what we've done is put an ARIA label of close on the button, and then we've explicitly hidden the SVG with ARIA-hidden as true and focusable equals false. Sometimes it can get a little tricky with SVGs, so we want to make sure that we're explicitly hiding that from screen readers. The next ARIA label situation would be related to the icon only button. It would be icon fonts, SVGs, or canvas. First, you're going to decide if this is decorative. If it is, you're going to hide it from screen readers. And if it's not, for instance, if it's a data visualization or it's only an icon without text next to it, that's when it's going to need some kind of label. So in this first example, we've decided that the icon is decorative. We have a success message that's getting displayed after we've done something. And what we're doing is just hiding the SVG and leaving the text by itself. So in our success message, the check mark that we have in an SVG is hidden using the same method as before, ARIA hidden equals true and focusable equals false. And then we also have the text that says your changes have been saved. There's no reason to add an ARIA label to the whole thing or hide any text. We're just letting the text be as it is and hiding that decorative icon. If the icon is actually conveying meaning all by itself without any actual text with it, or the text happens to be like a path inside of the SVG and it's not actual text, what we can do is add role equals image to the SVG, and then that's when we would use ARIA label to say what the icon is trying to convey, like warning unsaved changes. You would use that same markup for a chart with a simple description. You would use SVG role equals image, and then your ARIA label would have the short description of, bar chart showing revenue growth from 2020 to 2024. You'd include the chart graphics, and the screen reader would read that as an image. If you had a chart or graphic with a lot more complexity in it or needed a longer description, you would put those tags on the wrapping div. So if you had multiple SVGs or different elements within there, you would have a div with a role of image, and then you can have ARIA labeled by, you can have ARIA described by, and then this way under that chart, you can utilize any of the text that's under there. So in this example, we have an H2 with an ID that matches the ARIA labeled by, and it says monthly sales chart, and then a paragraph with an ID that matches the described by. In this example, I'm also showing that the information inside that paragraph, we've added the class of SR-only, so that's only going to show to screen readers. So if it says something like, this chart shows monthly sales, et cetera, that might already be reiterated within the graphic itself, within the SVG, or within this sort of element. And so you don't need to re-say it to visual users. It would only need to be shown to screen reader users. So this is an example where I'm using all of the different tags. So you would use only what applied, and you can include that heading in as screen reader only text as well if that's the markup that made the most sense. And that's going to be the end of the recommended when you should use ARIA label methods. It's possible that you might have a custom widget maybe certain programming languages or elements or some other situation might arise where maybe a screen reader text won't work because it breaks styling or it's stripped out by a framework, or maybe it does cause keyboard or focus issues if you have custom select widgets, SVG only buttons, or some other limitation. Then you would use ARIA label in order to make it as accessible as possible. There are a lot of situations where people will recommend using ARIA label to make something more accessible. And while in a lot of those situations it can technically be right, there's often a much better way to go about it. There are some drawbacks to using ARIA label. It's not reliably translated. It requires an additional place to go to update the information. So if you have somebody updating the text of a button, you also have to remember to go in and update the ARIA label. It only allows plain text and can't be styled, and it's harder to view during testing. Most of the time, screen reader text and using the proper HTML element is going to be the better option. In rare cases, screen reader text does have the potential to impact the layout and spacing, so if you do notice a layout shift of some kind when you're using it, first check your CSS. If the class has been properly added and all of the CSS definitions are being applied without being overwritten by CSS specificity, you may have to use ARIA label and then notify the platform or developer of the issue. So while ARIA label isn't technically wrong in the following situations, it's better to think of it as a last resort. The first situation is going to be when you have no form field labels. In almost every case, it's going to make more sense to use a label. It's better for all users, but there are forms that might make sense without a label. The most common is going to be the search form. So if you can add the screen reader only class to the label, or even use ARIA labeled by with that class on the heading or the text, that's going to be ideal. So as an example, using the preferred screen reader only class, we have a search form that has a label with the correct for attribute and a class of SR only that says search this site. And then you have the input that has the ID for, that matches the label and includes the placeholder. And then we also have a button that has an ARIA label, because a lot of times these search forms will use like a magnifying glass icon or some other way to indicate that this is the submit button. And then so for the screen reader users, we're going to use ARIA label on that button. If you did want to use ARIA label on the input itself, you would have that same form. Just instead of the label, you would put the ARIA label on the input itself. The next most common scenario that I see is when it comes to links. Now, most of the time, you don't need to completely replace link text. Better link text is, again, helpful for everyone. And most of the time, you don't need to add extra text to a link that only screen readers can access. Something like privacy policy doesn't need any additional information or context. It's a link that goes to the privacy policy. Extra text just ends up making things unnecessarily wordy. So consider changing the text of your link or button. A more descriptive link would probably help all users. But if you can't change the text because of the design or the layout or some other reason, that's when you want to use screen reader only text. So in this example, we have a link that goes to the blog page that says view all, and then a span with the class SR-only that I put the space inside of so that it reads clearly and then includes the words latest posts. The only time you would use the ARIA label instead is for some reason that's outside of your control. Another situation I've seen that people use ARIA label for is for images or like linked images. The only time to use ARIA label on an image is when it's an SVG or there's a limitation in the platform or site builder you're using. You're going to want to report that kind of issue to the developers, and then you can use the ARIA label in the meantime. But in almost every case, alt text is going to be the better choice. Now, linked images are a little trickier to write alt text for, since they need to include the link destination and might not need to describe the image itself. If the image is linked to something like a pop-up or a lightbox, it needs to be a button, which means you'll want to include the image with alt text, and then a hidden button that has unique text. So this is a little more complicated to implement. But in both these cases, you should use methods other than ARIA label wherever possible. Now, using ARIA label for background images is something I've seen done as a workaround for when you're working with page builders. But a background image is considered decorative. So if an image is being used in the background and it needs alt text, it's better to insert it as an image and then use CSS to style the image. The CSS property object fit is what is going to let you treat an image like a background image. This also means that if the CSS doesn't load, then the image is still going to be shown. You can take a look at the WordPress cover block to see how they position an image inside of a container to look like a background image but function as an image. If you're limited by the platform or builder for some reason, reach out to them and ask them to implement or add the option for the more modern and flexible implementation of image insertion. Once you've reached out to them, in the meantime, you can set role equals image on the container and then use ARIA label for what you would add as the alt text. Now, one of the trickier situations I've come across is when you're using inline images with text. When you have an image or an SVG taking the place of a word or conveying a meaning that's meant to be read together with the text, you're going to want to test it. Proper alt text will usually be enough, but images used in this way can sometimes be unpredictable, especially when the layout is being manipulated with CSS. As with most things, if you can use a non-ARIA label method and it works, that's the way to go. But if it's confusing and not something that you can change, it might make more sense to add an ARIA label to the wrapping element. So when shouldn't you use ARIA label? Basically, any situation that I have not mentioned yet. Anything I haven't mentioned would not be an appropriate situation to use ARIA label. It means you're using the attribute for something it wasn't intended for, and it's going to behave in unexpected ways. Use alt text, use labels, visually hidden text, other attributes. But if you have a scenario where you think ARIA label should be used that I haven't mentioned yet, it's always possible that I just haven't come across it yet. The internet is always evolving. So send it over and we can discuss it and I can let you know if you're onto something. So when you're out in the wild reviewing your pages, how do you decide what method to use? You have the few situations when you'll need to make sure that you add ARIA label to an element. You have multiple landmarks, icon-only buttons, image-like elements. Most of the time, when you're adding other things to your page that you think might need some extra content for screen reader users, you can ask yourself a few questions. There are some additional questions you can ask depending on the specific element, but generally, you're going to ask yourself, does this actually need more context, or is it okay to leave it as it is? Can I add something visible or rephrase this for all users instead? Is there something else nearby that can be used as the label? If so, use ARIA labeled by. Can I add some extra hidden text to this? If so, use screen reader only text. And then if you've answered no to each of these questions, then it might be an ARIA label situation. As always, take extra care when using ARIA and test it as best as you can. This will make sure that everyone is able to interact with your site and get what they came for.